Our Story Production presents The Road to Our Story, spotlighting an in-depth look at many of The Road to Our Story magazine's featured articles. So get ready, for you're about to travel on The Road to Our Story.
Hello, I'm Jason Howland, and welcome to Speaking of Health, a place to help you learn how to live a longer and healthier life. March is Colon Cancer Awareness Month. Colon cancer is a disease that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year, and it's a disease that in many cases can be found early, treated, and possibly prevented. Joining us today is Dr. Leroy Hodges. He's a board-certified general surgeon at Fairmont Medical Center, which is part of Mayo Health System, and he's someone who's very passionate about this subject. Thanks for joining us today on Speaking of Health.
Thank you, Jason. You know, at least 150,000 Americans every year will be diagnosed with colon or rectal cancer, and this kills approximately 50,000 Americans every year. This is a cancer of the large intestine or lower bowel. Most of the time, this begins as benign, non-cancerous polyps. The person who can have the best effect in preventing a colon cancer or being cured from a colon cancer is you or the patient themselves. We recommend a screening program that generally starts at about age 50, and if that screening program were implemented for all patients and all people in the community, it would prevent or cure almost all colon cancers.
Now, when you say a screening, what exactly is a colon cancer screening? What happens?
A screening test, that's an important point right there, because we all know that when we're ill or have a problem that we frequently need tests to diagnose what the problem is. A screening test is a test done on a person who's perfectly well. They have no suspicion of any kind of illness. For colon cancer, we start the screenings at about age 50 because the risk goes up with age. And the screening for colon cancer is a test called a colonoscopy. This is a fiber optic scope, which is like a long flexible telescope with a TV camera literally at the end of the scope, that we're able to guide up through the colon or lower intestine to be able to examine for any benign precancerous polyps or cancers.
And is the patient asleep when this is happening?
Absolutely. I generally tell my patients that they might be a little bit nervous about their first colonoscopy, but they won't be about their second, because I guarantee they get through it well without remembering anything about the test itself.
And you talked about polyps as something that you're looking for. What are polyps?
Polyps are like small growths that can turn into cancer. And the technicalities of it are that the lining of the colon needs to be constantly replaced because it's worn away by what passes through. So these cells of the lining divide constantly. Well, if one of these cells has a mutation where the DNA or chromosome is damaged, it might forget the signal to stop dividing. The room is too crowded, stop. Well, it doesn't recognize that anymore. So they keep growing and dividing and growing and dividing until it humps up and can grow into a bit of a lump. That is not a cancer at this point because they just sit there. They just happily divide and sit around. If one of those cells now in the polyp, which can number millions or billions of cells, has an additional mutation, a different mutation, now it's hungry. It wants to eat anything around it. And of course, now it's a cancer.
And can it vary with patients? Can some patients have just one single polyp and some have hundreds? Or is it usually a lot of them or none?
The vast majority of patients have no polyps. We find polyps in a screening program in 20 to 30% of patients in a ballpark number. However, there are certain circumstances and certain genetic conditions where people might have thousands of polyps, literally. Those patients are at high risk of developing cancer before the age of 40. That's a small number of patients. However, a lot of patients will have 1 or 2 or 5 polyps. It's a smaller number that have many.
Is the analogy, would it be similar to, say, skin cancer? A lot of times skin cancer starts as a mole on your skin. Is a polyp sort of like a mole inside your colon?
That's an outstanding analogy because it gives us something that we can see and that we've all known about that we can then translate to something that's happening internally that we don't really have much understanding about. Honestly, a polyp is very much like a mole that can sit there for some time and then can transform, as we call it, into a cancer. So that's a very good way of looking at it.
So does someone need to feel sick or have symptoms before having a colonoscopy?
One of the sad things about colon cancer is someone can literally have colon cancer for 5 years and yet still not know it.
Wow.
And it's during those 5 years that cancer is growing and potentially spreading to distant sites where it's now impossible to cure. Our aim is to find that cancer before it has a chance to spread, and that means looking when the patient is not ill. That's the only way to reliably find it early.
And the magic number generally is age 50 for people?
Correct. For the general population, age 50 is when we start because the risk of colon cancer starts to grow tremendously starting at about age 50. From age 40 to age 80, your risk of colon cancer in a single year goes up probably at least 10 times.
So I know you said many patients won't have symptoms early on in the disease, but what if the colon cancer has progressed? Then what are some of the symptoms?
What the patients want to watch out for are the classic warning signs that we might hear from the American Cancer Society. The blood in the stool is something that everybody gets a little nervous about when they see it. Unexplained weight loss is a very important thing. We all like to look for weight loss and we try endlessly. It's when we're not even trying and we lose weight that becomes a bit of a concern. Abdominal pain. Most abdominal pain is not cancer, but it's certainly something that needs to be checked out. And changes in the bowel habits where things are just not normal anymore.
And if you have any of those symptoms, you should
go to your doctor, talk about them, and come up with a plan for investigating in the best way for you.
So, Dr. Hodges, when you're performing a colonoscopy, you have that camera inside the colon. You're able to see pretty well, I'm assuming.
Correct.
What exactly do the polyps look like as you're looking at them with the camera, and what does a cancer look like?
Well, the lining of the colon is relatively smooth. We're in a tube, literally, and the tube has little bends and twists and has little folds in it that we generally can see around pretty well. A polyp might look like a mole, a flat kind of lump on the side of the colon, but sometimes they can grow enough so it almost looks like a mushroom. The polyp might be the head of the mushroom, and the weight of the polyp would stretch out the soft lining of the colon until it's like a stalk. So it could be like a cherry on a stem almost. And those are pretty easy to remove. The flatter polyps are a bit more difficult to remove, but generally can be removed.
And the cancer, if it's actually cancerous, what does that look like?
A colon cancer is about as ugly as you would imagine. We always think of cancer as an ugly disease, and they look ugly. They truly do. They tend to be irregular, red and angry, bleed easily. Sometimes what we call ulcerated, which means part of it's dying and it's a white, ugly base. So if it's ugly, there's a decent chance it's a cancer.
When you're performing a colonoscopy, you can actually remove some of the polyps with the scope, right?
Exactly. The medium to larger size polyps, we use what's called a snare, which is very much like a wire lasso. We lasso that polyp and we tighten up the lasso. It's basically a loop of wire with a plastic sheath. We put the loop around it, slide the sheath forward to tighten up the loop, and we run electricity through it to both burn through the base of the polyp and cauterize it, which helps prevent bleeding.
So actually, a patient that has polyps, they don't need to come back for another procedure. Actually, while the colonoscopy is being performed, you can take care of those polyps.
Correct, and that's one of the big advantages of colonoscopy as a screening tool for colon cancer, is we can frequently biopsy problems and remove polyps at the same sitting rather than coming back for an additional test.
So who's more at risk for getting colon cancer?
Obviously, as we talked about, the biggest risk is age. Men get colon cancer a little bit more than women, but it's a big, important problem for both genders. African Americans have a little bit higher incidence, but again, it's only a small difference. People with what we call risk factors, we really watch out for. Family history of colon cancer, or certain diseases of the bowel, such as colitis, which is an inflammatory or inflammation of the colon, like ulcerative colitis, increase the risk. And there are some genetic traits. Some are patients who have hundreds to thousands of polyps that we spoke about earlier, and there are some where there aren't polyps involved that people can be increased risk, such as Lynch syndrome, which is a small percentage of patients.
How about lifestyle factors, exercise, diet, smoking, that kind of thing?
Those are relatively minor factors so far. We would like to find some environmental factor like a diet or a chemical that if we got rid of it would prevent all colon cancers. We're not there yet, but we know that, number one, if you're healthy and strong, if you get a colon cancer, you're going to recover better from the treatment. We also know that certain things can reduce the risk. If you're at a healthy weight, if you don't eat a really high-fat diet, and interestingly, small things like an aspirin a day may have a beneficial effect. Vitamin D seems to have a beneficial effect. So we're looking for more and more of those ways to help reduce the risk.
How about high-fiber diets? Do those help?
High-fiber diets have been up and down in terms of whether they help with colon cancer, and we've heard about that many times because it's gone yes and no and yes and no in several cycles. Right now, we don't think that a high-fiber diet directly prevents colon cancer, but clearly it keeps our colons healthier, keeps our bodies healthier, so it's an advantage in that respect, but it doesn't directly prevent colon cancer.
Well, just like any other cancer, I'm assuming there's different stages of colon cancer, right? And what are those?
The stages go by number with various factors that help us find the number. They go from 0 to 4. 0 means a cancer that's just begun. It has not even gone through the top layer of the bowel. A stage 4 cancer has spread to distant sites such as the lung or the liver, and in most cases those situations can't be cured. But the stages in between, we can have a great effect with surgery, sometimes surgery alone, sometimes surgery with chemotherapy added. With rectal cancer specifically, radiation can be helpful.
You talked about surgery. What does surgery encompass when you have colon cancer surgery?
Typically, a surgery is going to involve removing part of the colon. In the vast majority of cases, we put the colon back together so people function normally. In the Mayo Health System, and in addition at Fairmont Medical Center itself, we have the advantage of having experienced surgeons doing a laparoscopic surgery, and we have advanced that technique such that we're having very safe, reliable colon surgery done laparoscopically.
And what do you mean by for folks that don't know, what is laparoscopic surgery?
Laparoscopic means we make very small incisions, such as in the belly button, and sometimes we'll call it belly button surgery, where we bring like a narrow telescope with a camera on the end through there, and we can look inside the belly, and with other small punctures we can have instruments where we can manipulate the organs, including the bowel. We can divide the bowel or cut it and put it back together with very small incisions.
How small are we talking?
The incisions that we're working through with the laparoscope vary from a half an inch to an inch. When you're removing a portion of the colon, we always need an incision somewhere between 2 and 3 inches to be able to remove that portion of the colon. That compares to an open operation where we'll do a 6, 7, or 8 inch incision to do the operation. So there's a dramatic difference in the recovery. The patients are home earlier, they're stronger, and they have less pain.
And they have less scars too, right?
Absolutely. And that's, that doesn't seem important the day of surgery,
right,
but it's a kind of a nice benefit about 6 months later.
Right. So let's say other than surgery, what are some of the other treatment options? I know you talked a little bit about radiation, but is it like other cancers, chemotherapy and that
Correct.
Kind of thing?
Colon cancer has to have surgery to be cured. There aren't any cures available now that don't involve surgery. However, when we have a cancer that is spread to the lymph glands locally, not distant, but just locally, we'll generally recommend chemotherapy. That's for colon and rectal cancers. For a tumor that's spread to distant sites, there are things that we can do to help a patient have a longer, more enjoyable life, but we generally can't find a cure. With rectal cancer specifically, radiation can be helpful in improving the chance of cure itself, because a rectal cancer is limited right there in the pelvis.
If I go have my colonoscopy and I have no polyps, how often then do I have to have another colonoscopy?
With no risk factors and a normal colonoscopy, you should have another colonoscopy in 10 years. Now that makes people smile. They don't mind waiting 10 years for the next colonoscopy with the good news. If you have polyps that are precancerous, it varies by how many and how large. One small polyp means a colonoscopy in 5 years. Several or larger polyps means a colonoscopy in 3 years.
Lastly, are there any certain steps that you should take in life to help prevent colon cancer?
Surgeons typically have to treat and operate on major problems. We don't ever get to prevent anything. But interestingly, colonoscopy itself, if we remove all the polyps, we actually prevent some of the cancers, because not every polyp turns to cancer, but every cancer started as a polyp. So that is one thing that we really enjoy, being able to prevent a serious disease. But for the patient themselves, or for the healthy person themselves, a good diet, good exercise, staying strong, avoiding alcohol and avoiding smoking. And there's a couple things that I mentioned. Taking an aspirin a day and probably vitamin D, maybe as part of a multivitamin, probably have some small but real effects in decreasing the chance of getting colon cancer.
And get that colon cancer screening, because that's the best way, right?
Every person should meet with their doctor and discuss what their screening program should be, because we vary it according to the needs of the patient and what their health status is, et cetera. So we want to individualize it for every patient.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're all out of time, but I want to thank you, Dr. Hodges, for joining us today on Speaking of Health.
My pleasure.
And have a great day, everyone, and be healthy.
There you have it, folks. One of the favorite stories ripped from the pages of The Road to Our Story magazine. Let's have a look at another.
Hello, I'm Jeff Hagan, and welcome to Spinning Wheels. This is a program that talks about spinning wheels and about wheels itself. Anything that you want to know about wheels. Car wheels, bicycle wheels, motorcycle wheels. You kind of get the idea. Well, today we're excited to have with us an expert on wheels, car wheels exactly, Tom Hawkins. Tom, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, Tom, you are the president and CEO of Hawkins Chevrolet in Fairmont, Minnesota. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in the car industry itself?
Sure thing, Jeff. I graduated from St. Cloud State in 1981, and I was looking for a job. I enjoyed St. Cloud and loved the town, wanted to stay up there and find a job. During that time after I graduated, my mom and dad called and said, listen, Edgar Larson, a longtime salesman, has decided to retire and just take care of his farm, and we'd like you to come home and get some young blood in the car business. Would you consider coming home? And I thought, well, that might be a good idea, getting business with mom and dad. So I moved home in April of 1981 and started in the car business, and a small business, not too many people worked there, a couple mechanics, a body man, my dad and I, and so he taught me what I needed to know to get started in the car business. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Everybody that starts in the business, and the young business people, that type of thing, remember usually their first sale. Do you remember the first car sale you made?
Oh, Jeff, do I ever. Yeah, when 1981, if you remember, was back in the Carter years where interest rates were 18, 19%, and
right.
The economy was tough. And so when I moved home, there wasn't a whole lot of business going on. And so when I was learning the business, I just thought maybe what I need to do is go out door to door and just meet people. I didn't know anybody. I was just home from college. And so for whatever reason, I started going southeast of town towards Ceylon and just going farm to farm and knocking on doors. I did that for, a couple, 3 days, and I'd walk up and introduce myself and say, I'm Tom Hawkins. My dad's a Chevy dealer in Sherburne. Do you want to buy a car? Nope. I did that numbers of times. Nope, not interested, but thanks for stopping by. And probably about the third day I was out doing this, I walked up into Farm Place of Harold and Elsie Kaler from Ceylon. And same question, I'm Tom Hawkins from Sherburne, and we're selling cars for my dad. Do you want to buy a car? And they said, yes. And I was shocked. And they said, yeah, we're kind of in the market right now. Really? So anyway, they said, come on in and have a cup of coffee. Now at that time, I'm not a coffee drinker. I didn't like coffee, but I heard in college that if you drank, they offered you a cup of coffee, you'd have 20 minutes. So I said, okay. So I walked in the house and sat down at their table, and out of the cupboard she pulls a jar of Folgers Crystals, of all things. So my first real cup of coffee was Folgers Crystals, and I enjoyed that. The next day they came in and took a look at a car, and at the time we had a 3-car showroom in Sherburne, and we had a Caprice Classic sitting on the showroom floor. Okay. Now this car was loaded, Jeff. It had two-tone paint. It had velour interior with a split bench seat, wire wheel covers. It had power windows, or power locks. No power windows, still the crank windows, but it had power locks. An AM/FM stereo radio. I mean, it was loaded. It had a list price of $10,162, and I couldn't imagine who would pay that much money for a car. I'm sitting there, my knees are shaking, and they're looking at the car, and I forget how it ended, but they ended up buying that car, and that was the first customer. And so they've been pretty special to me all through the years.
What's it like being involved with your father to start out with in the business? I know a lot of family businesses have the dream of being able to pass it on to the next generation. What was it like working with your dad?
Well, it was great, actually. He started out in his life with an ag degree and worked in the ag business. And he came back to Sherburne because my mom actually grew up in the car business in Jackson, Minnesota. If you remember Marquardt Motors in Jackson, my grandpa started in an oil company there. Mm-hmm. So my uncle was back working in the dealership in Jackson. He talked my mom and dad into moving back to the area. And Sherburne had a dealership available in 1967. So Dad bought that, and that's how we ended up there. So when I moved home, I wasn't planning to work in it, but he just basically taught me the basics on selling a car. A little bit about, because we're a small business, I learned a lot about service. I learned about customer service. Mm-hmm. I learned in a hurry about how important cars are to people and some of the pitfalls you have when people's cars break down. But it was a lot of fun. Over time, as I learned more, my dad kind of moved over to the service, and I kind of took over the sales the more I learned. During that time in Sherburne in the mid-'80s, we started getting into computer systems. Mm-hmm. And, of course, by that time, my dad was not into computers that much, so I kind of took over that. So working with my dad actually was a real joy. He was good to work with. My mom also worked there for a while. She'll tell you the story. I had to fire her. Uh-huh. Mom and I didn't see eye to eye on everything. We had our arguments. In fact, it was well known around the dealership. We'd have arguments right there. So I finally had to fire her, but part of the deal is I had to pay her after I fired her, so she was fine with that.
Long-term severance, huh?
Yeah, so if you ever talk to my mom, she'll tell you that story. Uh-huh. Okay. But no, working for my dad was a good beginning for me.
Good. Well, it's good to hear a little bit of a background for you, and you're still involved with the auto business, as we all know. So, yep. But a big part of this program is that we have viewers that actually want to ask you some questions about the car industry itself, and I know that they want to find out what's going on when they ask some questions about what we want to do. So let's go to the phones and take a couple calls.
Sounds good.
Caller, are you there?
Yes, my question for Tom is, I'm thinking about buying a car, and I don't know which is better for me, to lease or to buy.
Okay, so they're wondering about, they're thinking about leasing or buying, they're not sure about which. What do you think as far as the different options?
Well, actually, it's a good question. There's a lot of people who ask that question quite often, and a lot of people who don't know a lot about leasing. Basically, what I like to tell people is leasing is very similar to buying. It's just basically, it's like a loan that has a shorter term with a balloon note. So in other words, if normally you'd maybe get a 5-year loan, you're paying for the whole car over 5 years. With a lease, you might have a 3-year lease, but at the end you'll have a balloon payment to pay the car off. Now there's a couple advantages of that. Number one is that usually you can get a smaller payment. And because you're not paying for the whole car, you're paying just for basically the depreciation part.
Okay.
And another advantage is that generally a new car is more affordable in a leasing situation. So those are the two biggest reasons that people lease. Because it's a little more complicated situation, not everybody does it. But it does take a little bit stronger credit to get into a lease, mainly because with smaller payments you're not building equity.
Right.
But other than that, it's a really good option. What I tell people who ask me whether they should lease or not is you need to look at how the lease is structured. What's happened in the lease business over the years is that the manufacturers on new cars have put much of their incentive money in the leases. So they incentivize the leases and makes it more affordable. So when you see an ad on TV where they're advertising a low payment, $199 lease, mm-hmm. it's because they put incentives within that lease program. And so if you're looking at a new car and you're a payment buyer, and if you're a person that trades every 3-4 years routinely, mm-hmm. you really need to at least look at a lease and compare. Not every lease is as good as a buy, but a lot of them are, and especially when the manufacturer incentivizes them.
Okay, so basically it differs per the situation of the individual, is kind of what you're saying. Yeah. Different factors in for that.
That's right. And the other thing that you have to think about is that if you're a high mileage driver, generally leases don't work, and the main reason is because leases are structured around an average mileage of 15,000 a year.
Okay.
And if you're a high mileage driver, you're on the road a lot, there's a lot of excess depreciation that comes when you put on high miles. And so by the time you add that into a lease payment, mm-hmm. a lot of times there's not an advantage. The other advantage that people use for leasing is sometimes for tax reasons they can write off the lease as an expense on a monthly basis versus capitalizing it if it's in a business
sure.
use. So that's another reason people like to look at the lease.
Okay. Well, I see we have some more callers there, so why don't we go back on the line. Caller, you're on Spinning Wheels.
My question for Tom is, what is the difference between the best price sale and traditional vehicle pricing?
Okay, thank you, caller.
Well, I'd like to say that basically we are a best price dealer. We have been since 1997, so I know a lot about that subject. And what's interesting about that is that over the years in the car business, and part of the reputation that used car dealers have had is because of the negotiation process. For years, the traditional thing has been somebody comes in and you negotiate the best price and you work out a deal and you sell the car. And so what happens, the way to get to have the best price on a car is to be a good negotiator. Know how to ask, know how to be bold. Well, not everybody's like that. And so basically in a negotiating situation, the car dealer usually wins because the car dealer is more experienced at that. So one of the problems that I had is that I was taught in this business that in traditional selling that if you sold a car to somebody the first time, you negotiate, get the deal done, but then once they know you and trust you, the next time you can make more money on them.
Okay.
Now that was true, and so but what it started happening when I'd make friends with people who'd buy cars with me, they'd come in the next time, they'd ask me, "Was that your bottom dollar?" And I'd say yes, knowing that it wasn't my bottom dollar, because I needed to make some money on them because I had the next guy who was a negotiator, I had to average out and make a profit. And I just was not comfortable in that scenario. So what we did in 97 and went to a best price scenario where we made a decision to price all our vehicles at a fixed price. We would study the market. It's more work because you have to study the market and look at the price in every car and make sure the car is affordable. But then we don't negotiate the price. And what happens is that we post that price on the car, we put it in the window on the paper, and now with the internet we put it online. So our price has to be competitive or people aren't going to buy our cars. It's out there for everybody, not only our customers, but our competition can see our price.
Sure.
And if we advertise we don't negotiate, they can come look at our car and go to the next dealer and try to get it cheaper. So our cars have to be affordable for us to put them out there, and it's a much more better environment for buying. People are less under pressure. They know what the price is. They can walk away. They and they don't have to worry about being a good negotiator to get a good price.
Okay, well, thanks, Tom, and it's been great having you with us today, giving us a little insight into the car wheels industry itself. But before we leave, I understand that we have a special guest that's available with us via satellite today, actually.
That's right.
And in fact, we're going to go to the back lot of Hawkins Chevrolet for the old car guy.
Hey, folks, there. This is old Rusty. I'm back on the back lot here, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself. When I was a teenager, I was just like any other teenage boy. I was nuts about the old cars, and I wanted to make a living in the car business, and I was sure that was the place to be. But boy, in 1941, December, the Japanese, they changed that for everybody. In 1941, through the year, Detroit produced a little over 3.5 million cars. But by 1943, they produced 139 cars is all they produced. Because Ford, Chrysler, GM, all them, they were making airplanes, ships, boats, tanks, guns, helmets, everything you could think of made out of metal because they were all set up. But by the time World War II got over, it was just absolutely to every major economy in the world except for ours. It gave us unprecedented economic and political power, and I decided, Rusty, we're going to be part of that. In 1945, 46, you could buy a brand new car for $1,020. Of course, the average guy was only making $2,400 a year. So I decided cars is the place to be, pent up demand, everything else. But I tell you what, we got more we'll tell you about some other time. I got to run now. It's break time. Time to get a donut. We'll see you again next time.
All right, thanks, old car guy. That was really something.
Yeah, he's been that way for years.
All right, well, Tom, we want to thank you for joining us today, giving us an insight in the wheels industry of the car industry itself. Before we go, though, if there are people that have questions or want to know more about you, do you have a website that people can go to?
Yes, I guess if you want to head to our website is at www.hawkinsbestprice.com. And my email is hawk@hawkinsbestprice.com. I'd recommend that if you have any questions, anything you want to ask about, I'm the car expert. I'd be glad to help you out. Even if you don't do business with us, that's fine. Send an email. If you got a question about any topic, I'd be glad to get you some answers. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/thedifferenceshawkins. So that's the name of our our fan page at The Difference is Hawkins. So go there and join the page. We'll be posting things there off and on different things going on at the dealership.
Okay, well, thanks, Tom. Thanks again for being on. And we want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us today. And we'll see you again next time with more Spinning Wheels.